Welcome, everyone. This is the first out of hopefully two conversations, perhaps even more, that are focused on the major shifts that we are seeing in global development aid. In recent years, we have seen countries like Sweden end their development cooperation with numerous countries and shift priorities toward national interests. And at the same time, we have seen a global reduction of development aid along with the withdrawal of USAID. Today, we will discuss the current global politics surrounding development aid and development cooperation, and the effect that recent changes have on the people in the African continent in particular. We're very happy to have Adebayo Olukoshi with us today, a leading scholar on international relations, governance, and human rights. He has served as a research coordinator at the Nordic Africa Institute, director for Africa and West Asia at International IDEA, along with numerous other institutions that it would take too long to bring up here. We're very pleased to have you with us and sharing your expertise on this topic. We also have with us our own Lennart Volgemut, who is a board member of FUF and an expert on development cooperation, having worked in the field of Swedish development for decades. He served as the director of the Nordic Africa Institute and as a visiting professor of African Studies at the University of Gothenburg. I would also like to take this opportunity to mention that FUF is an independently financed association and are therefore dependent on its members and monthly donors in order to keep doing seminars like this one. And we would appreciate all the support we can get. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Lennart.
Thank you very much, and very, very welcome, Adebayo Olukoshi. We have a long relation in the past when you worked at Nordic Africa Institute, and you succeeded in getting us very engaged in many aspects of African development at that time. And also Swedish policy, actually, on Africa. You were very much engaged in that. We are today asking you to represent African scholarship, looking at what is happening in the world today. And we will sort of also discuss what it means with the development cooperation being cut down and the self-interest increasing all over the developed world. But first, seen from the South African perspective, because you are now professor in Pretoria, South Africa, what do you say of what is happening all around the world today? And how does this affect Africa? A very big question.
A very, very big question indeed. I'm actually at the Wits School of Governance, University of Witwatersrand. And this is a subject that we have been debating for over a year. We've had convening on Africa in the changing world order and how Africa can protect and defend itself in view of the changing world order. Maybe if I can put it more generally for a start. When the world order was crafted after the Second World War, what is generally referred to as Pax Americana, virtually all African countries were under colonial rule. So that by the time they gained independence, they basically were rule takers. The rules had been set already, and all they could do was to appeal for a modification of the rules to allow them to have a meaningful participation. You know, all the campaign for a new international order, new communication order, for increased aid, even a Marshall Plan, as it were. During this current phase, where one can say that the old is dying, but the new is yet to be born in the Gramscian sense of it, we are confronted with a very confused situation, actually. The old multilateral system, rules-based order, has basically been undermined, to say the least. Some people actually say that it is dead. Multilateral institutions where Africa was active, like the United Nations, particularly, but even the World Bank and the IMF have been weakened considerably. And African multilateral institutions themselves, such as the Africa Development Bank and the African Union, are themselves severely weakened. So basically, what most commentators in Africa see of this current order is that it has created considerable challenges, but it also might contain the seeds of opportunity. Seeds of opportunity, I would say, in terms of reclaiming some degree of sovereignty over Africa's governance and development. Challenges, of course, in the short term in terms of the collapse of development aid in favor of self-interest and security in Europe and America. There was a considerable shock in South Africa, for example, over the closure of the USAID and the withdrawal of medical aid for the treatment of HIV/AIDS and the like. But governments have also had to adapt fairly rapidly. And in this regard, I think we can look at the spate of measures which governments have taken in order to increase domestic revenue mobilization. Sometimes
Adebayo,
yeah.
Perhaps stop here, because there are a lot of questions that I should want you to clarify a little more in your very interesting opening sort of presentation. The first one is really, which came as a surprise for me, the effect you say it has had on AU and the African institutions.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little more on that? I mean, yes, you are right that things are happening, but why would that affect the strength of the African institutions themselves?
Well, because as you would know, the member states of the African Union pay an assessed contribution for its functioning. That assessed contribution goes largely to the payment of operations of the AU, salaries and the like. For its programmatic work, the AU depends, like for the European Union, 90%. And bilateral donors also make a substantial contribution to its work. And with that avenue drying up, they find themselves in a situation where they've had to tune down considerably on their programs. And the same thing is true for the regional economic communities, which are heavily dependent. I mean, a community like ECOWAS, which is supposed to be a flagship of African regional integration. It was very successful for a long time. But that success was hinged partly on the support of donors. And the equation has changed, and the African Union and ECOWAS are confronted with a series of fallouts from the changed equation. In the case of ECOWAS, it's preoccupied with trying to contain the security crisis in the Sahel and the resignation of some of its members from ECOWAS, and that has meant basically diversion of resources to that purpose, with very limited success actually, because the resources themselves are very scarce.
So what you are saying is that the effects of USAID has stopped its work, and the diminishing support from the donor community in general, and in additional also the UN system itself. It affects not only project level on sort of health sectors, problems, but also institutional building around Africa.
Absolutely, absolutely. But not only USAID, mind you. You recall that in the context of the wave of far-right entry into government in several European countries, there already was an attack on development cooperation.
Yes.
And in some countries, they actually went for a drastic cut in aid in order to put their own national interests first.
Yeah, you know that that Sweden cut the poorest countries, 13 of them, in this year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Sweden,
it's
Netherlands, even the UK, cut all their aid before. So the arrival of Trump and the closure of USAID, the closure of the Millennium Challenge account simply reinforced what was already a trend that was going on. And African governments, I think, have had to deal with the shock of that cut in aid. And as I said, part of the fallout from that has been the declined capacity of the African institutions, but also within African countries, as governments have tried to raise domestic resource mobilization, including taxation, like what you saw in Kenya, is simply rubbed off in a wrong way, particularly on the youth. And that explains partly why there was a massive youth uprising in Kenya. But the uprising has not been limited only to Kenya. And it raised the question of why are we being taxed so much, even on women's tampons? Why are we being taxed so much when, in fact, the government is delivering so little? And government cannot deliver much more because it doesn't have resources to deliver the public services required. The loss by the ANC of its majority in the parliament during the last election is also partly reflective of this, because most people who voted against the ANC, who are previously ANC supporters, hinged their choice on the fact that the service delivery had deteriorated considerably. So resources that the ANC government was able to use on maintenance of roads and supply of public utilities and electricity supply and the like, basically had to be diverted to other purposes. So basically, the effect has been both direct and indirect. And those countries that are fortunate, those African countries that are fortunate to have a sizable diaspora community, have been trying to develop a scheme whereby they can better use their diaspora resources for the development of their country. In the case of
the development
Nigeria,
you are now presenting to us, does it differ considerably between countries, or is this a general development?
You mean in terms of the diaspora?
No, in the effects of sort of withdrawal of development funds.
No, I think it's general across countries.
For example, South Africa, do you see the same effects there as?
Yeah, South Africa may be less donor dependent than, say, Burkina, but South Africa's health sector was almost completely dependent on foreign assistance to handle the deadly HIV/AIDS pandemic and things like tuberculosis. And when it was cut abruptly, families just went without medication until they could make alternative arrangements. So it is across the board, even if it is in varying proportions. a case of Nigeria is not a donor-dependent country, but at the time when the aid support was cut, the consequence in Nigeria, in Ghana, and elsewhere is that they resorted to the international private market, Eurobond loans, which basically has meant that the African debt crisis that is ongoing.
But how could a country like South Africa really have a policy that led them into that dependence on foreign funding?
It's a question which all of us ask, but it's also probably reflective of the massive range of demands on the government post-apartheid. And unfortunately, I think South Africa, like other countries, have just simply succumbed to the structural, what I call the structural imperatives of dependence. If you take the issue of debt dependence for the African countries, a lot of them basically have had to go into the Eurobond market, which can be obtained without much conditionality, but which comes with high interest rates, and then they have difficulty servicing the loans. And in order to service the loans, I give you an example again. Nigeria spends 90% of its revenue on servicing its debt. 90%. So they have only 10%. And that means that civil servants can go for 6 months without being paid.
Can we see that we are back to a big debt crisis again in Africa?
Oh, the debt crisis is alive and well. Structural adjustment is alive and well. Ghana, Tanzania, several others have gone back to the IMF discipline. And the IMF has had to bail them out with resources in order to enable them service their external debt.
And today it will be much more difficult to get out of these debts. There will be no debt reliefs.
It will be a big problem. Well, there's the G20 program for debt relief. There's the G20 program for debt relief, but only one country has partially benefited from it, which is Zambia. I mean, the Zambian case is, of course, completely hopeless because there's also massive, massive debt owed to the Chinese. So it's not just debt to the Western donors and to the IMF and the World Bank. They had a lot of debt from the Chinese. And since the Chinese are not exactly under the same roof as the Western donors, they've had a lot of difficulties. As you know, also in the case of Kenya, massive infrastructure debt to the Chinese. And when Kenya could no longer service the debt, the Chinese simply took over some of the infrastructure. And are the ones running those facilities, like the ports.
So what many talking about that China and other countries would take over much of the relations within Africa means that they will be not come away from debt.
It will require, in my view, a pooling of sovereignty. You know, up to now, African countries go it alone.
Can you expand on this a little more?
Yeah, the idea of coming together and collectively negotiating has not gained any traction. So Zambia goes to negotiate as Zambia. If it gets $50 million from China, it is happy. But Zambia doesn't go as part of a collective of African countries to say this is what is possible, this is what is not possible. Our development is being halted because of the heavy burden of development aid, of the external debt. And in the face of the decline in development aid, we can only do so much. There's also the issue of financial external flows from Africa. Africa continues to hemorrhage capital on a massive scale.
Can you develop that a little further?
Yeah, in a sense in which, so at the same time as Africa is stepping up on domestic resource mobilization, some of the international capital operators, like the multinational corporations, are also repatriating funds on a massive scale from the continent, sometimes at an inflated level. And a commission was set up by the African Union to look at that dynamic. If I'm not mistaken, from their last report, it was mentioned that $60 billion flows out of the African continent annually as of, I think, 2020. Now, 60 billion is not a child's play for a continent that is hamstrung for resources. But countries are not prepared to work together in a coordinated and coherent way in order to address this issue. Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt are the highest in terms of this hemorrhaging of funds, of external resources to other parts of the world. Other countries will simply assume that, well, that's their problem, not our own. And until we overcome that silo mentality, amongst African countries, it will be a problem. I think the second thing is that you would have thought that Africa's resources, which are much sought after now, I mean, everybody is talking about rare earth, and Mr. Trump is going berserk over rare earth. China is in rare earth. Everybody is scrambling for Africa, but people talk of a new scramble for minerals in Africa. But the problem is, again, that people are negotiating individually. And you'll be very surprised that in the case of, let me give you an example of Zimbabwe, the Chinese have full control over its mineral resources in return for military security. It does not make any sense. In the case of the DRC, you are aware that President Tshisekedi went to Washington to sign an agreement to surrender the DRC's rare earth minerals to the US in return for protection by the US over the crisis in East Kivu and the attacks from Rwanda, M23, and Uganda.
Adebayo, to go back to your first, your start, you ended up by saying that you also saw some possibilities coming out from this very complicated and complex situation that we are in. What signs do you see there? And what hopes can you inflict?
I think those who have understood that the old is gone and probably gone forever, and that there's no reinventing that old order, including, budget support, generous grants, and all of that, have simply looked inwards. I've simply looked inwards. And I'm very happy that at least a handful of countries have rejigged their tax laws in order to expand the net of contributors to the tax basket. Some have done it clumsily, as in Kenya, you do a kind of shock treatment tax approach, which riles everybody. But others have been gradualist in their process. And I have seen that in a lot of countries, in a number of countries, internal revenue is growing. We are not yet feeling the full impact of that, the benefit of that, partly because of the amount that is spent on servicing loans. I think there's also a much greater awareness that whether we like it or not, Africa has to find its own way in the world. The world is not going to come to help Africa to find its way. And on that basis, I think we can hope to build a much greater sensitization amongst the leaders of the continent. Hopefully push them towards joint approaches to tackling common problems.
And so you see the need for joint approaches, but you don't see really efforts having started yet. Or can you point at some positive developments on that area?
Well, some efforts have started. I can take the example, even if it is small, of Botswana and Namibia that have signed an agreement to work together on their diamond, on their natural resources, and central to the pact which they reached was basically to avoid a race to the bottom, whereby a mining company, let's say Anglo-American, will go to Namibia and say, this is what we offer. And then if Namibia refuses, say, okay, we can go to Botswana, and then Botswana will accept it, even if it is an unfavorable term. So they said their joint agreement is practically to prevent that race to the bottom. With that also, I think I've seen an increased number of countries putting an emphasis on domestic beneficiation in order for Africa's position in the value chain to increase considerably. So, refinement of natural resources. Let's take the example of Angola, which opened its first gold refinery. So they are no longer going to be exporting raw gold. Burkina Faso, also the same thing, in spite of its security crisis. So it's yielding a kind of wake-up call, however unevenly, however slowly. And if we can succeed in pushing the leadership to think more in that direction. And what is funny is that a decade earlier, the African Union Summit at the level of heads of state had adopted the African mining vision that suggested exactly these issues. But nobody paid attention to it until Mr. Trump started his unilateral measures, imposing tariffs and all kinds of things. And I suppose for many of them, the question of regime survival and security suddenly became very paramount when riots and demonstrations in the face of cost of living crisis threatened to have them overthrown.
So that opens up the question about Trump and the very recent developments that take place now. I mean, how is it when you in the discussion in South Africa among sort of professionals? How is it being discussed today in Africa? Is it seen as a threat, or is it seen as
No, it is definitely seen as a threat. Venezuela, Iran, Gaza, definitely seen as a threat. And I think at different levels, first that it shows that the kind of vulnerability that we have as Africans. If Mr. Trump decides that tomorrow on the basis of his false narrative about the genocide against white South Africans and the confiscation of their lands, decides to bomb South Africa, there's very little that any country on the African continent can do. And there's very little that other countries will do to support South Africa. The threat to annex Greenland was a wake-up call for Europe. But somehow Europe is unable to fully shake off its vassalship to the United States. It's unable to fully shake off its vassalship. So even as it's trying to build a security umbrella for itself, which further diminishes the prospect of a return to any development aid in the near future, it is still very, at any opportunity that arises, they align with the US. For example, in the vote on Gaza, in the vote on Venezuela, and the like. I suppose the only difference is the situation with Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the refusal of most European countries to become part of the unilateral war that the United States declared. So there's of course a lot of talk in our circles, in professional circles, of the dangers of where a scramble is already on, but the dangers of a new colonialism happening on the continent, and what can be done in order to prevent what is the worst consequences. I think also that on the other hand, the behavior of Trump and of some European countries towards protesters among African civil society, I hear a lot of talk that, well, nobody can come to lecture us anymore on democracy, because we have seen the most undemocratic behavior by some of the most advanced democracies of the world. Which is perhaps not good news. Which is perhaps not good news for us as citizens. But in the past, if country X in Africa went too far, you could be sure that Sweden, Norway, Denmark, even the United Kingdom, Germany, will openly or quietly raise concerns with the government to try to rein them in terms of their excesses. Today, most governments will take their position that we are not different. We're in the same boat. We're in the same boat. The way you treat the sans-culottes in France, the way what American commentators are calling Trump's Gestapo, ICE, has been behaving in the United States. The very slow condemnation of the extreme measures that were taken by Israel against Gaza. All of these things, in a sense, tend to suggest that many of the European countries have, and America have lost the moral high ground. Have lost the moral high ground where issues of governance are concerned. And we're not too different from each other. And as I said, it's not very good news, because for those who have been pushing for democracy in Africa, they have suddenly woken up to see a tightening of civic space. Laws have been rushed through parliament to restrict the capacity of civil society to operate, to restrict the right of citizens to protest, and so on and so forth. The muzzling of the media, is very commonplace. You saw the developments in Tanzania. I mean, who could have believed that in the aftermath of Tanzania? Actually, I was thinking of you, and I said, I wonder what was going through your mind, that Nyerere's Tanzania could descend to such a low level.
And
You
we
know,
and
and
we
then you
were
have,
and exactly as you say, what is Swedish reaction? We withdraw
yeah,
instead of trying to convince Tanzanians to go back to the democracy again. No, I mean,
exactly.
I wanted to ask you, because you have been so engaged in democracy in Africa, to ask you on your views, but you gave them very clearly here. I mean, you see the developments in other parts of the world, and unfortunately, even Europe today, being making it problematic to defend the democratic development in Africa, and the results has been a backslide on democratic development in many
Yeah,
countries. So,
yeah, a massive backslide, but also triggering a regrouping, which I think if it gathers momentum, we might be back to the kind of social movement efforts that we witnessed after 1945, culminating in Africa's independence in the 60s. And there I would point out that those social movements, trade unions, women's groups, students' unions, and others that are comatose today were so central to the struggle for independence and were not dependent on donor funding in pushing their case. As many civil society organizations have collapsed in the last 5 years because donor funds have dried up, we are faced with a situation in which
we're out of picture for some time. You started out by saying that the diminishing support also to the civil society in many African countries
yeah,
will have enormous effects on the possible developments
yeah,
towards democracy in Africa.
yeah. And I'm saying that as a result of the diminished support, I just want to recall that historically, the movements that helped to underwrite African independence, the students, the trade unions, the women's movement, were very active and not donor dependent. They did not depend on anybody's external support in order to carry out their protests against colonial rule, against the hot tax, against women's tax and all of that, and to demand independence now. We entered independence and development cooperation grew, and many civil society organizations, which were doing good work, but were heavily dependent on external funding. With the drying up of external funding, in the last 5 years at least, many of them have collapsed. We have entered a phase where there's a very robust discussion going on how we can rethink democracy and rethink development. I think you recall that when I was at the NI with you, when I was at the Nordic Africa Institute with you, is one of the things that I wanted to pursue, rethinking development
Yes.
in Africa.
That takes us that takes us in the end to one point that you and I worked very much on, and I have continued all my life, and that is that all support from outside has to be owned by someone in the country itself. Otherwise, there will be
Absolutely.
no effects. And what has happened what you have described here is exactly that this
Exactly.
has the problems that has met
Exactly.
because not.
Exactly. I mean, the kind of things that we said in the 90s and early 2000s that sounded very, very radical has become mainstream. I hear sometimes even governments saying that President Ruto, for example, saying that nobody owes Africa a living. Africa must navigate its way, and so on and so forth. No, if you said that in the early 2000s, they will be laughing at you as a raving lunatic. At the end of the day, I think if the message sinks in that Africa has to be the author of its own development and governance, then I think we would have gained something from what is going on presently.
Adebayo, with these words, I think thank you very much for a very illuminative presentation of the present situation and how you live through the chaos that we all are going through and affecting us, of course, more or less. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leonard.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming to talk with us, Adebayo, and for sharing your insights with us. And thank you as well, Leonard, for your moderation. As I mentioned, this conversation is hopefully the first of two and perhaps even more similar conversations that are discussing the topic of a global shift in development and its effects on Africa. So keep your eyes peeled for more in May. And with that, this conversation is over. And thank you again, Adebayo, for coming. And I hope you will come and share your expertise with us in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.